support of the Patreon has really made a difference and provided a model to produce free speech without censorship. I want to thank you guys again for your support. Let's talk a little bit about a cool element called iridium. And it's a very rare and very interesting metal for a number of reasons, but iridium holds some interesting evidence about the Armageddon that happened during the Crusades, and may help explain why crusading knights wore full-body armor made of metal, as they may have known about their armor's special unique qualities, that their armor plating would serve as the perfect protection against electromagnetic frequencies, and that this harmful EMF radiation would be worse for them than swords, and in fact is still very useful radiation armor to this day. And in fact there's evidence of 5 great extinctions that have come before us. And world-renowned mycologist Paul Stamets has compelling evidence for his hypothesis that the many species lost on Earth in the last few centuries are the evidence of yet another concurrent 6th great mass extinction. And throughout all of these great Armageddons, there has been one lone survivor that transcends them all: the fungi. And fungi itself is very interesting, mycelium and mushrooms, and I still recommend watching Paul Stamets' TED Talk from over a decade ago. But fungi are beings very similar to us in a lot of ways, in fact. They are fully conscious sensory beings that are aware, who have asserted compelling evidence of being intelligent, many times over. And due to their homeostasis cathedral's lack of anthropomorphic aerobic movement, they are looked at often more like plants. Not that plants are unintelligent, however, mushrooms are closer related to animals. And really the other way around. Fungi and humans are part of a much larger eukaryote called the Opisthokonta. And while cell walls make a huge difference between the plantae and the Opisthokonta, it's really more of a difference of the structure of the political body which differentiates animals from fungi. And to sum up Paul Stamets' hypothesis, essentially the species which unite with the fungi strive and all others fall by the wayside. And for saying so, fungi spared his mother. And you probably have to see this to believe it, but the pictures are pretty brutal. However, it is true, and it is a crazy story. But long story short, watch Paul Stamets and eat turkey tail. And looking at evidence of lost and prehistorically lost creatures, it's a pretty solid claim. But astonishingly, that gets us back into iridium and the Alvarez extraterrestrial hypothesis of the 5th major extinction. And essentially their theory was that iridium was not from this world and represented an asteroid. And I know about half of you are going to have a problem with that, so let's try to find the middle ground territory. So what Alvarez was talking about was the discovery of an apocalyptic layer of iridium found around the planet, and it's all around the planet, but there's only one layer of it. I'll say it again, this layer is the only iridium on Earth. You see, I was kind of downplaying it when I said it was rare. It's actually much more than rare. It's unique. And all over the planet, under this apocalyptic layer of iridium, the only iridium on Earth, there are tunnels and caves. There are Inca caves in Peru. There are the Magdalenian caves of Lecco. And across the Americas, the Lakota, the Sioux, the Inuit. And if I left out the caves in your home country, it's only because they're countless and there's too many to name. Worldwide, there are legends of cavemen survivors. Cavemen survivors that survived underground for hundreds of years, perhaps, at least a century, with plants and animals for food and air and tools, and great machines. And all these stories tell that they waited 100 years under the earth, waiting to rise above the surface when it was safe again. Only, of course, by that time they had changed much. And these are often stories of hidden tricksters, not always peaceful, but certainly sophisticated and intelligent, a high-tech, tiny people, almost conceived of as magic, but universally regarded for their tools and workmanship. Stories of these subterranean humanoids living in the earth. But they're not just stories, and of course there's tons of evidence of tiny people, but first let's talk about corn. There's a great ephemeral film from Disney made back in the 40s called The Grain That Built the Hemisphere. And its intention was to militarize corn by telling the legacy and history of the evolution of maize into the monocrop we call corn today. And I need to preface this by using a quote from Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma, where Michael Pollan says corn is our master. And what he means by that, or what he's referring to, is that in nature, and he uses the metaphor of the flowers and the bees, nature at its core is a story of exploitation, as the bees exploiting the flower and thinking it is getting the advantage over the flower, The flower is quietly laughing to itself about how shrewdly it has manipulated the bee into proliferating its species. Both are the victim of mutual exploitation. And in the same way that this drone is unaware, humans are unaware that they're deforesting in order to grow a grass that would otherwise fall by the wayside to stronger, weedier species. But the irony is the history of corn is not one of monocropping. The history of corn is one of diversity and of sophisticated agriculture techniques, which through a process of scholastic journalism and extremely selective breeding, guided the evolution of maize into corn over many generations and lifetimes. This widespread practice led to changes dependent specifically on climate, better suited for specific soils. The objective was a diverse portfolio of seed that could survive blights and different storms and natural disasters in different areas. Corn as we know it today could not have existed naturally in the wild. This is interesting because this is one of the first facts admitted about the technology and civilization of pre-Columbian Americas. However, eventually, with corn's new masters, shifted the objective from diversity to size. And even with the thousands of corn varieties that still exist today in Latin America, many have been lost in order to just produce one bigger ear of sweet corn. And either you do or you don't consider selective breeding a sort of engineering, but it still happens to this day. But it's clearly a very powerful technique, and even with strides in genetic engineering, it's still more fruitful, it's still more reliable than genetic engineering. So you might be asking yourself, in selective breeding, how do you get bigger corn? And the answer is a process known as genetic inbreeding. And what you do is you take a breed of corn and you inbreed it with itself, and it produces smaller and smaller corn. And you keep inbreeding until you reach a point where each new generation reaches a plateau of decrease in size. And you might be wondering, why the heck would you do this? Inbreed corn to make it smaller, especially when we started out with the question, how do you get bigger corn? But stick with me. The whole time you were inbreeding breed A, you were also inbreeding another breed B until it was also the smallest size. And when you put both breed A and breed B together and stopped inbreeding, you got the biggest corn. And that gets me into giants, and that gets me into dwarves. And a lot of people are talking about giants right now, and that makes sense because giants are cool and impressive. But I think the reason people are impressed is for the wrong reasons, and also possibly based on some sort of a logical fallacy that somehow presumes that bigger is better, which is not actually always the case, or at least there are exceptions, or more specifically, there are circumstances where little people shine, and in the spectrum of people, bigger or smaller, there's no such thing as a lesser person. And as the Japanese have a saying that the tallest nail is the first that the hammer hits, and that therefore you ought not want to be the tallest nail, it's important to remember that little people are great. And also, unlike giants, which are the victims of evidence suppression, there's a ton of evidence of little people, all around us and even way back when. There are little people everywhere, by land or by sea, across all the continents, but of course in Indonesia where they found Homo floresiensis, and her archaic link to Homo agaster provide compelling evidence for the Into Africa theory of a pre-Africa and the path of human evolution. And little people have often been respected. Historically, they've been considered magical. And the dwarf oracles of Egypt were famed, cared for, and beloved, and enjoyed a high place in the courts amongst the royals. In fact, there's a high proportion of dwarfs buried in the royal cemeteries of the first dynasty in Egypt, which I think is interesting because there's such a cultural normative against short people. So dwarves were guarded and protected, and this is a positive stereotype, as opposed to a negative stereotype such as the magical powers of albinism, which we'll get into in another time, but essentially around the African Great Lake regions, such as the Congo, albinos are kidnapped, traded, butchered, and consumed for their magical powers. This is clearly contrary to how dwarves are treated. So it's a positive stereotype, and being little is associated with nobility and is a great honor. And there's an interesting professor named Dr. Susan Martinez, and she has a book, The History of the Little People, Their Spiritually Advanced Civilizations Around the World. But essentially she's an anthropologist who extrapolates on the archaeological evidence of the Homo floresiensis, otherwise known as the Hobbit people, who are considered extinct, not by some natural disaster, but were the supposed victims of cannibalism, and they were eaten by the invaders who were recent inhabitants to their islands. And an example is the Maori, whom only arrived a few centuries at most before the British, and proceeded to devastate the wildlife and eat everything, and eat most species into extinction. Not just the little people, but also the moa, giant birds, the last of their kind. By raiding their nests, they just wipe them out in only a few years. And there are tons of other examples of animals wiped out, including the giant eagle. But it would just be one more example in a countless list. And I guess the most important thing to get out of the story is if you thought that all the problems in the world came down to European colonialism, it's just slightly more complicated than that. But we're told that these little people were wiped out and eaten. And if that's the case, where's the evidence? Where are these bones that we're looking at? What can the evidence tell us about history? And what can the evidence tell us about what really happened? Well, you find them under the mud. And that is one of the funniest things about the sedimentary layer around the planet. Kind of the major mud flood giveaway. But if you dig, you will find them. And they're in Indonesia, and they're in the Congo, they're in Peru and in Chile, they're even in Northern Europe and in Pedro, Wyoming. In fact, they're even in Syria and everywhere. I mean, if you look for them, you'll find them. And just look at this little guy. He's tiny. And though early British scientists said that because of the size of the cranium, the Homo floresiensis was clearly stupid and mean, I can't help but think she's kind of cute. And I can kind of see Dr. Martinez's narrative about these little people and the land of the little, and how advanced an entire society run by little people could be. And maybe with frame of reference upon the African pygmies, it makes sense that the Homo florensis, that the makeup department which modeled the Homo florensis chose more earth tone colors. However, there's no reason that the Hobbit couldn't have been white. And let me put it another way. Concerning white hobbits, I would be surprised if there weren't. In fact, I would be surprised if you found any race of any kind of human that didn't have albinism. Actually, albinism is found in all species, and there's some pretty cool studies on the MC1R gene that shows that woolly mammoths and Neanderthals share the same redhead gene, which is why some mammoths were blondes and some mastodons were redheads. But I'm about to say, and I hope our famous African friend is with me, that albinism is not the unique gene controlling or dominating the Caucasoid type, often referred to as the white race. And a lot of the evidence for this can be found in Dr. Holland's RNA thesis paper about hypervariable segments of mitochondrial DNA representing the Caucasoid and represented in the Caucasoid lineages in the Caucasoid mitochondrial DNA stacks. And this is such a cool paper that didn't get enough press that I'm going to give it the Andreas Award for being the coolest paper of the year, until I mention another one. Not just because it helps reveal the intricacies of the human race or because it was designed accidentally while trying to solve the AIDS crisis. Not just because it opens up the door for RNA sequencing and provides us with a new tool that works as a DNA deep search function. It's exciting for so many reasons, but I'll get back to that later, trust me. But right now, Dr. Holland's paper is relevant because it essentially proves that gene SLC24A5 is not unique, and that furthermore, unique genes do exist, and we're just made up full of them, filled with super sequences, and we should be looking into those sequences for things more interesting, such as a promoter sequence for super strength, or the genes associated with super intelligence, or maybe age prevention. And there's just so many things going on with DNA that are actually different, like this cow that doesn't take steroids but happens to have the right gene to keep growing muscle. We found a very similar gene in the Neanderthal. And a lot of this upsets people because of their preconceived notions about race and their mythical fairy tales about them. But even look into those stories and you'll notice that there's a lot of differences, and start noticing the diversity in the characters. Because this upsets everybody's agenda, including the phobos, as well as the NPCs. But I think I can unite everybody by upsetting them both simultaneously. So I ask, is there a difference between this and this? And don't give me any apples and oranges. Just remember the law of equivalency for a second and tell no lies. Are alligators the same as crocodiles? Sure, alligators are like crocodiles, but each one is different and special and unique, and it's important to appreciate and to seek out uniqueness. In fact, the first meaning of life, given to life, was to study life in all of its wonder. So whenever someone educated says, scientifically it's all the same, well, how would you feel? And just remember that. No, it's not all the same. But the difference is not just gene SLC24A5. There's another genetic difference, and I encourage you to look for novelty. If you want to find it, could be worth a shot. And oh yeah, in case you want to look up that Dr. Holland guy, who I gave the Andreas Award to, I think you should, because that was Dr. Dexter Holland, From the band Offspring, that's right, Dr. Dex is a real doctor. Pretty cool. The support of the Patreon has really made a difference and provided a model to produce free speech without censorship. I want to thank you guys again for your support.